Welcome, everybody, and good evening. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Central Delaware County, welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Natural Gas on the Move, Pick Your Poison with Roberta Winters, President of the League of Women Voters of Radnor Township and an active environmentalist. The League of Women Voters of Central Delaware County hosts an annual memorial lecture every year in memory of Jeannette Ross to celebrate her legacy as a committed environmental advocate. The program this year addresses the impacts of natural gas on our region. While fracking is not occurring locally, we are dealing with the consequences of natural gas extraction. Any transport of natural gas will impact the land, air, and water in southeastern Pennsylvania. Liquefied natural gas is slated to come into our area by trucks and trains and go out on tankers. Both bring its own unique hazards and associated risks and benefits. Roberta will discuss the latest developments on these topics. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan civic organization committed to promoting political responsibility through informed and active participation in government, citizenship, and elections. We have received many of your excellent questions prior, and they were shared with Roberta prior to the meeting. Please utilize the chat function and ask any additional questions. Also, we are recording this event, and a link to the recording will be sent to all of those who have registered for the program. The recorded program will also be available on our website. And now for a quick look ahead. All League members are invited to the LWV-CDC annual meeting on May 27th by Zoom. Please register on our website to receive the Zoom link. At this meeting, we will vote for a new slate of officers and board members and confirm the 2021-2022 budget, local program, and proposed changes to the bylaws. We invite all members to participate, and your participation will help us achieve a voting quorum. Please save the date for a two-part webinar series on financial inequities in the criminal justice system. Part 1 is being held on May 13th at noon. This will focus on pre-trial pitfalls such as cash bail, pre-trial incarceration, and access to an effective legal counsel. Part 2 will be held on June 16th at noon and will focus on financial inequities of a post-trial system involving conviction, consequences, and costs related to incarceration, a criminal record, employment challenges, social issues, and court fees. Lee Aubrey, Delaware County Public Defender, will moderate a distinguished panel of experts for each part. Please register online at LWV-CDC.org for both programs, and you'll receive a Zoom link to participate. Many thanks to the lead board members, Ann Mosikowski, Jane Brennan, Kathy Youngman, and Roberta Winters for their help in organizing this program tonight. Let us please welcome Roberta. Jane will introduce Roberta. We hope you enjoy the program this evening.
It's my pleasure to introduce Roberta Winters, who has served 2 terms on the State Board of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. First as Director of Natural Resources, and second as Vice President for Issues in Action. She coordinated the Marcellus Shale natural gas extraction study guides and chaired the addendum studies on pipelines and pooling. She currently serves as president of the Radnor League and advocates on numerous civic and environmental issues. She combines her expertise as a retired elementary school teacher with her background in science to connect the dots on important issues such as those surrounding natural gas operations in Delaware County. Roberta, you're on.
Thank you. And I'm just going to share a PowerPoint presentation. Then I'll come back at the end and you can hit me up with your questions. How's that?
Thank you.
As I told people when we started, I thought it was probably better. Everybody can see that, correct? Terrific. I thought it would be this would be a better program for Halloween than for spring when we're all happy. But, you know, we'll put on our happy face and talk about the poisons that we have around us, which are both the natural gas liquids and the liquefied natural gas. And there's a lot of confusion about that. So I'm going to start very simply and move forward. So you all know the natural gas you burn probably in your stove, and that's methane. It's colorless, it's odorless, and they add that terrible smell. It smells like rotten eggs, so that we know there's a leak when the gas is not being ignited properly. But methane on its own is colorless. Basically, we have choices when we're dealing with methane and natural gas, because you can either pick your poison, because some of it will probably put you under at a slower rate than others. So for example, if you were involved in a natural gas explosion, like, you know, the house in your basement fills up with gas and it explodes, you're going to get out of the picture pretty quickly. If you are maybe go to sleep when there's a gas leak, you could be suffocated and die that way. Or we can wait until the climate change caused by methane probably will put part of us out anyway, because methane is a great trapper of heat, and over the period of the next 20 years is 84% better than carbon dioxide in terms of what it's doing for climate change. And it will remain in our atmosphere for about 12 years. So even though it's more potent, it lasts for a shorter period of time than carbon dioxide. So if we look at it as a climate problem, it'll take a slow poison. If we look at it in a more immediate emergency situation, it'll knock us out pretty quickly. Now, just what about where is all this natural gas coming from? Well, natural gas is coming from Marcellus Shale right now, which is underground in most of Pennsylvania. And we are now, so you know, the second largest producing state in the United States for natural gas, only second to Texas. So we are producing a lot. And you can see that it's at various depths throughout the Commonwealth, with the more shallow parts in the western part of the state, and the deeper parts sort of around that Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, Susquehanna County area. You can also see that it not only changes in terms of thickness, but on the next slide, you can see that there are different types of gas. It's not just one type of natural gas in Pennsylvania. And there's actually a line that goes through our Commonwealth. So if you were a natural gas developer and you wanted wet gas, you'd go to the western part of the state. If you wanted dry gas, you would go to the eastern part of the state. Now, the wet gas contains not water, but other kinds of gases such as ethane, propane, butane, and pentane, which are very valuable. So those byproducts are very valuable in the wet gas. The dry gas, on the other hand, is pipeline ready, and it has other benefits. Let me talk a little bit more about this wet and dry gas, because that's part of what our story is about. If you're looking at wet natural gas, these impurities, methane, propane, butane, give it a lot of value. And however, in order to be used, it has to be processed. So you cannot just use this wet natural gas as it exists without doing a lot of work. So that's labor intensive and energy intensive work. The dry natural gas, as I've mentioned before, is pipeline ready, and it's what they call thermally mature. If you looked at that map, the dry gas is where the anthracite coal was. Remember the anthracite coal we had in like Mount Carmel in that Wilkes-Barre area? And the wet gas is in that area, which is less thermally developed. And that's where that bituminous coal came from, like where they're having the longwall mining out in Indiana County and stuff. So it all has to do with the geology of Pennsylvania. Now, let's talk about the risk number one. So rather than call it a poison, it's basically a risk, because whenever you're dealing with things like COVID-19, we learned a lot about risk. Well, the same is true with natural gas. So natural gas liquids are those gases that are mixed together in the wet gas. It's the methane with the ethane, propane, and butane, which are heavier than air, and they again sink out of the methane over time. So there's also some natural gasoline in this wet gas and some pentanes, which you might see mixed into additives for different kinds of fuels. But the ethane, propane, and butane are basically the gases that are in the wet gas, which will give it added value. So how do they get the wet gases out of the pure methane? So it could be as much as 50% of the wet gas, which is not methane, which is what you burn in your stove. So they either have to absorb some of these byproducts into oil and then boil it off, or they can refrigerate it and chill it so these heavier gases fall below the methane, or they can use some cryogenic expansion. So they both cool it and expand at the same time. They chill it to 120 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. That's pretty chilly. And then they condense and it drops out, just like, when you breathe out on a cold day, you see that condensation. Well, the same thing happens with these gases. Then once they get the ethane out, that's a real winner. They like the ethane because then they have an ethane cracker. And you'll hear about that cracker up there in Beaver County, I bet, once in a while, because Shell is building this huge production up there, because that uses hot steam to break the ethane down into ethylene. And ethylene is what they use to make plastics. And we all know how everything today is made out of plastics, from the grocery store to the houses, to the car bumpers. Everything's plastic these days. And at the same time, the ethane cracker often siphons off the other gases along the way. So it's sort of like one of those sand jars you see with the different colored sands going up. That's the way these crackers work. So you get different gases off at different levels, and the ethane gets flared off at the top. If you go around Marcus Hook, you'll see some of these kinds of contraptions down there. Now, this is some of the natural gases, and I just wanted to let you know that they are being used and they're very useful. So if you look at the formulas, you can see ethane is the simplest one. If you remember your chemistry, there's 2 carbons and 6 hydrogens, then propane, then butane. Each one gets another carbon in those 3 cases, and they add more hydrogen. So that's really, it is heavier. So again, they're used for plastics, feedstocks, fertilizers, and particularly the plastic. So most of it's used for industrial purposes. So it's very useful and very lucrative. Now, natural gas liquids are increasing in their hazards because we keep using more and more of them. So ethane is a greenhouse gas, but when any of these hydrocarbons are burned, you're going to get more carbon dioxide in the air. And during the life cycle of natural gas, that's from the wellhead to the gathering line, to the processing, to the storage, to the distribution, there's always leakage. And it leaks more significantly than the company would like us to believe. And these leakages are what they call volatile organic compounds. Organic means it has some carbon in it, and volatile means it goes up into the air. And those are precursors to ozone. And if you're around ozone, you'll realize that all of these pollutants impact our respiratory systems and also can cause premature mortality. So for those of you who don't know, if people who have done studies from Penn and in Chester realize, the kinds of incidences of lung illnesses such as asthma and other kinds of respiratory diseases are significantly higher in areas where there are these kinds of air pollution characteristics exist. And also, believe it or not, it impacts things like plant growth and crop yield. So climate change is one of those pervasive things, and these organic compounds have an impact beyond that in terms of our physical health and that of the flora and fauna around us. Now, there are some immediate exposure threats. If, for example, you were exposed to these gases and there was no fire, you would just, get sort of dopey, get a headache, nausea, vomiting, the kinds of things that you would get if you didn't have enough oxygen, because this will replace the oxygen in your system. And I think anybody who's been around some fumes, you've probably always had those headache fumes sometimes when you're around something you don't like the smell of, particularly an organic compound, like cleaning solutions, things like that that you may have been exposed to. Over a long term, they can cause you things like, basically you get dopey. You can also, some of these chemicals kids used to get high on. Remember when they used to go to the drugstore and sniff some of this stuff? You can get, sort of euphoria, but eventually you could lose your memory. You sort of get a little dull, and eventually you can have cardiac pulmonary issues, seize coma, and basically die. So none of those things are very nice to have happen to any of us, and hopefully none of us will be exposed to the natural gas liquids in quite that extent. And if it's in the liquid state, you could get frostbitten. So you never think about getting frostbitten from gas, but you could if you are exposed to the liquid type, because that's what it is in the pipelines. So the pipelines are shipping liquid natural gas. So if you're going through the Mariner pipeline, it's cold and it's a liquid. So from those of you who remember your simple chemistry, if you have a gas like methane or ethane or propane or butane, think of that balloon. And when you squeeze the balloon, you put more pressure on it and the molecules get closer and closer together. And if you push it hard enough, you could actually make it liquid. Be hard for us to do. So it's usually easier to cool down the molecules as well as provide pressure. And then the gas molecules turn into a liquid. So you can put a combination of pressure and temperature, lower temperatures, and you can take those molecules of methane, propane, butane, and ethane and turn them into liquids. But they don't stay that way unless those conditions remain that way. So if you tried to ship these natural gas liquids as gases, it would be very difficult to handle them, to store them, and to transport them. So that's why they've figured out this system using basic chemistry to put a lot of pressure on them or lower the temperatures so they can be moved. And then they can be moved by pipelines, by trucks, and by trains. So you can see these liquefied natural gases on the roads and on the rails, and you won't see them underground, but they're there. So if you go to the Middletown Safety Coalition, you'll see that they've done a lot of studies because they were trying to keep the natural gas pipelines that held the liquefied natural gas the natural gas liquids out of their communities. And so these natural gas liquids are at negative 130 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? That's pretty cold. And the pressure is high as 800 to 1500 PSI. That's a pound per square inch, all right? So to give you a range of those things, at sea level, air pressure is about 15 pounds per square inch. If you're using a pressure cooker, you've probably, maybe some of you use those, they're like 30 pounds per square inch. That's about what tires are too. Now, if you're looking for 800 pounds per square inch, you're talking about the steam boilers in US naval vessels, okay? If you think about those old steam engines that went across, across the country, they were about 300 pounds per square inch of those things. So this is pretty high pressure. And so what happens is because of the high pressure, when there's some kind of rupture, crack in the pipeline, that an incident could explode, because it's just like the pressure cooker. If you don't follow the directions, right? Explodes. So that's going to happen. And the magnitude depends on a lot of things. It depends upon, how far you're away from the source, what the weather conditions are, and just how much is released. And if you were looking at the Mariner 2 pipeline, they had a 3-mile evacuation radius because technically, they're not going to do much. You're not going to really escape this too well. You just had to get out of the way. And we don't know because we've not really had an incident, but they have had instances other places where there is some kind of ignition, and it all depends again on the weather and how much is released and what the source is. It's not, something that's going to happen every day. There's different statistics that'll say, maybe there'll be one leak every 7.5 years. We don't know what that'll look like. Some people, John has done a lot of statistics, and it's certainly a lot less than ever you being in a car accident. But nonetheless, to think that there would never be a problem would be stupid, basically, because there will be a problem. We just don't know when and where it'll happen. And, may not even be in our lifetime. So that's the situation. And the weather, so if there's the risk again is relative because we don't know what the conditions would be. If it's immediate, there could be a fireball, which would be about as big as 3 football fields. If there's a delayed ignition and there's a damp, humid day, foggy day, there could be a cloud that would hang close to the ground, because remember, this is heavier than air, and it would hang down with the water vapor, and it could 1,800 feet in 3 minutes, and with ignition source, it could go back to burn up 3 football fields. But no matter what, you're not going to stop that fire, because until the gas that is in that pipeline is exhausted. And the only way you're going to exhaust that gas is to turn off valves in the pipeline to shut the flow, because the flow isn't going to stop unless it's shut off. And if those of you who remembered from my last presentation about pipelines, there are valves periodically along the pipeline, and they hopefully are remotely and electronically monitored continually, so that they know if there's a problem and they can shut them down. So the Middletown Coalition, as I said, had different statisticians come in, and they figured this one every 7.5 years. John figured, it's only a fraction of what would happen you would get in a car accident. So that's our friends, natural gas liquids. And again, the risk exists all along the natural gas chain. So from the time you see it in the actual gathering lines from the wells that are being fracked in the different parts of the Commonwealth, into the different processing centers, into the transmission lines, into the compressor stations, into your local homes and communities, there's always a risk. And when you go and decide to transport it outside the country or move it from an offshore drilling platform, again, there will always be a risk. And remember, the gas does not have a smell until it's put into areas close to home, which is in this, what they call a city gate. So risky stuff, but there's risk involved in all of our lives. The second issue, which is more becoming a little more prevalent in our communities today, is liquefied natural gas. This is the methane. This is the dry gas that is being produced in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. Basically, it's methane with a little bit of ethane. And again, it's either chilled to negative 260 degrees Fahrenheit. That's really cold. Or it's under high pressure to be liquefied. Basically, with liquefied natural gas, they tend to use the colder temperatures rather than the higher pressures. And when they have liquefied it, it's only 1/600th of the volume of the gas that would exist. So it's a lot easier to transport. You know what it's like when you try to stuff your clothes in the suitcase, right? The smaller you make it, the more you can fit in. Well, 1/600th, wouldn't you love to do that to your suitcase? When you open it up, everything would be great. So it's really compact. And it's only about 20 pounds per square inch, which is significantly less than the natural gas liquids. But the temperature and the reduction in volume is much greater. Now, the other thing that's interesting about methane, and I looked this up this afternoon, was liquefied natural gas only burns at a certain range. So even the gas in your stove, unless there's a lot of oxygen there, it's not going to burn. So between 5 and 15% is the ideal place where that methane becomes highly flammable. Now, what do you think happens when this escapes into the air? All of a sudden, it becomes the right percentage. So that's why there's a problem. Now, there's a unique risk of problems when there's release of liquefied natural gas, because if the vapors are ignited, the fire is inextinguishable. That means no matter how many EMTs you've got there, no matter how many fire companies are around. The same is true with the liquefied natural gas or the natural gas liquids. You're not going to put it out. And there's going to be second degree burns possible within 30 seconds for those within a mile. So if there's a problem, it's going to be bad. And it's even a possibly because the gas is so tightly compressed as a liquid, when it does expand, it'd be like boiling, and it will explode as it comes out. There's a potential for a thermobaric explosive bomb. Not something you want, but there was one in Chicago in I think it was Cleveland in 1944 that just wiped out a whole square mile. And these are not things that you want to have happen in your backyard. And the emergency guidance is evacuate 1 to 2 miles. And we don't know as to yet if there was a vapor cloud, if the temperature was right, if the humidity was right, how far this gas would spread and what would happen. Now, a lot of people say, well, this isn't a problem, and it couldn't be a problem if it all dissipates into the atmosphere and becomes diluted. But there are lots of sources of ignition that we have in our world. So for example, if you turn on your car, that's a source of ignition. If you flip on the light switch, that's a source of ignition. If you happen to use your cell phone, that's a source of ignition. So the possibility of things happening in densely populated areas like Delaware County are probably greater than things happening in Susquehanna County, because there's just more people, more sources of ignition. So densely populated areas tend to be more at risk for any kinds of disaster because we've got more people here, we've got more sources of ignition. Now, why should we worry about liquefied natural gas? Well, remember when you looked at that map of Pennsylvania in the eastern part up there near Wilkes-Barre and Susquehanna County? That's where the natural gas is being fracked, which is being turned into liquefied natural gas. They have a great processor up there in Wyalusing, Pennsylvania, and it's compressing this methane into liquefied natural gas and using those very, very low temperatures. Now, because there are no pipelines that run from Wyalusing to Gibbstown, New Jersey, which is where they're projecting to have this facility that'll transport the methane to other parts of the world, they are going to look at different train routes. And so these are 2 of them. And you can see here that some of them go closer to Delaware County than others. And if I took the one on the left, which goes closer through Philadelphia and along the Delaware River, and blow it up, you can see that some of Delaware County would be, in fact, in a radius that would be one of the problems that would be in an area that could be impacted by an incident. The other thing is Gibbstown itself, which is where that little boat is actually within a mile of Tinicum. So that this is part of Delaware County, which would be severely at risk. And you can also note here that those areas that are highly populated are of some significance where these trains are going to be going through. These trains are specially designed trains, and so you know they've never been used before, but the FERC for the first time gave authorization in the last year or 2 to use trains to carry liquefied natural gas. They have like double barrels so that they're supposedly going to be more secure. And there's a lot of pressure right now for the new administration to overturn that rule because there's a lot of concern about the hazards that might result from these trains carrying liquefied natural gas. Now, the other thing they are doing, if they can't get it by trains, because again, there's no pipelines, they will take and put it on trucks. Now, trucks have different routes they can take as well. You can see some of them are closer to Delaware County than others. And they have less volume, but they have a much greater risk of an accident. So that's where they go. And I blew up the part with Delaware County so you can see the truck route here. And you can see the population density that it would go through. This would be 476, the blue route, right down 95 and then across the river. So that's probably not the, my idea of a fun place for these truckloads full of liquefied natural gas to be, but that may be the case. Now, once they get to Gibbstown, they're going to be put into what they call a liquefied natural gas tanker. These tankers carry 33 million gallons of liquefied natural gas. Now, it's so compressed, remember 1/600th of what it really should be, that will amount to 20 billion gallons of natural gas when it is heated up to be the right temperature and released safely, hopefully, into facilities that can use it. This is liquefied natural gas, 3 football field long tanker. Now, in most places where they have these kinds of tankers, and this happens to be, I think, in Finland or somewhere, you can see that they have them very far removed from areas of population. So that, for example, there's one of these terminals out at the end of the Delmarva Peninsula out on the end of Maryland. And they have, this is with a pipeline. This is the only facility we know in Gibbstown that's not really served by a pipeline, but by trucks and trains. So it's really remote. So they realize that because there's the potential of incidents, you want to be as far away from people and significant places as other. But Gibbstown, New Jersey is pretty close to significantly highly populated areas. So we have, if there were, when they open this facility as planned, they could have 1,650 trucks per day coming through these areas to load one of these LNG tankers. It would take them 15 days to load one tanker. And you can imagine every time you try to connect the hoses to the tanker, there's always a chance that things could happen. And there also could take 20 car trains that would unload into storage facilities in underground caves, because just as they have in Marcus Hook, in Gibbstown, they also have underground caverns where they store these liquefied natural gas, if it's in the case of Gibbstown, or natural gas liquids, if it's in the case of Marcus Hook. So there's a lot of risks along the river as you take both of these products out along either through Marcus Hook or through Gibbstown, because you're going to be going adjacent to a lot of critical infrastructure. You have the nuclear power plant over in New Jersey along the Delaware. You have, significant bridges. You have Interstate 95, and you have an international airport. They're all pretty close by, not to mention people like you and me. So that's one of the risks along the river that we have. We're hopeful that none of these things will ever materialize, but risk is existing. So how do we minimize the risk? What can you do? It's, we've got natural gas liquids on one side of us and liquefied natural gas on the other side of us. Well, we really need to join in coalition with other environmental groups. One of the things I've learned is in New Jersey, they have something called Empower New Jersey. They've taken all those, environmentalists. They've got the Sierra Club and so on and so forth, all of them in a list. And they work together to fight these things. We need to educate people. We need to communicate people. We need to participate. And eventually we need to litigate. And that's what's happening now. So if the bottom line is you need to delay, because that's the strategy that I've seen work best, is to delay. Because as we delay, hopefully we'll be going greener. The need for these products will be reduced. And as we go greener, we will have hopefully a better chance of cutting down on these risks. Because you extend those timelines when you bring them to court, you have these hearings, you appeal the permits, you litigate, you do everything you can to delay, delay, delay. And individually, if you don't want to join a group and you don't feel like suing people, you can work together to just do what you can yourself, which is, conserve your energy sources. You know what to do. Turn down the heat. think about what you can do. Can you hang your clothes up on the line instead of using the natural gas dryer? Can you cook everything at once in the oven instead of having all the burners on? Consider electricity for everything, because as we look to a greener environment, we're going to be using solar and wind, maybe revert back to some of our nuclear plants to, in fact, use electrically generating things greener and use that as a way to save on what we're doing now, which is burning hydrocarbons. We're going to move toward renewable, and of course, reduce your use of plastics. If you can avoid them, and if you can't avoid them, try to reuse them and repurpose them in different ways, because that's where all the natural gas liquids, particularly the ethane, being broken down to ethylene, is being used for plastics, and that is where we need to be stopping the need, and then we'll maybe stop the issues. Now, if you're going to advocate for anything, if you want to call your local legislator, if you want to call Delaware County Planning, whatever, tell them who you are and why you are calling them and why you have a story that's important, and tell them, I live along the Blue Route. I don't want trucks coming down with liquefied natural gas. I live along the Mariner pipeline. I don't want that in my, we need to make sure it's more secure. We need to provide adequate education for the people who live along it so we don't have an incident. Tell your personal story, ask them what they can do, if they will vote yes, if they'll vote no, what they'll do to announce, whether they'll convince other people that they don't need this. And again, continue to ask, provide fact sheets, and always thank them, follow up with notes, letters, and always talking points, and be persistent. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. They may not like you, but they'll get the message. You can advocate locally, attend those zoning hearings, attending those Board of Health meetings, the township meetings. Try to get them to do things like regulate light and noise, because right now, if you read the Inquirer this week, there's a Pico gas project that's making people mad in Marple. It's actually right along 320. You know where 320 is? And they are putting in, can you believe this? They're using the word a gas reliability station. A gas reliability station. That's a compression station that's going to be taking liquefied natural gas. You got that? LNG from Conshohocken. Now, how it's going to get there, I don't know yet, because the way the company deals things, they slice and dice the pipeline, so you're never sure where it's all going to come together. But you can be sure that it's going to be coming into Marble, where it's going to go to a gas reliability station. And that means it's going to be a compressor station, because that's a place where they're going to take that gas, which is negative 260 degrees, heat it up and send it on into people's homes and places of work. I'm not sure I would like it in my backyard, because it's going to be surrounded by, it says here, an 8-foot concrete reinforced steel wall that'll muffle the noise and deter intruders, and it'll also have 15 stacks that'll be burning something. So it's going to be a really nice addition to Delaware County, if in fact it goes through. And now it's going to be going, Marble Township said no, but now it's going to the County Court of Appeals to be heard again, and also to the Public Utility Commission. So we'll see what happens here. But if you are regulating light and noise, that'll help with some of the distractions that are caused by these compressor stations. We also need to fight to make sure all these natural gas operations are classified as industrial, so they're not put in residential areas. And you need to make sure our emergency preparedness people are trained to know what to do, and we as the public can monitor and assess their impacts. So that's coming to our neighborhoods too. At the county level, again, just like Marble has their meetings for zoning, so Delaware County has meetings for as we get our public health department, as we look at safety, we look at land use, we look at conservation, you go to county council meetings, you need to provide input, you need to encourage funding for the regulatory agencies that are going to be looking at these things, make sure we have the emergency responders and we have the oversight and planning so people know what to do who live nearby. People need to know things like, call before you dig. We don't want people bumping into these pipelines and causing an incident. Again, we are very lucky because after the last election, we now have a chief of environmental crimes unit in Delaware County under the district attorney's office, and that person's name is Melissa Muroff. So if you see something that's going on that's an environmental hazard, we now know we have someone we can turn to. Again, at the state level, we need to make sure we contact our legislators to fund the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, because while they exist, they've been severely undercut in recent years. We need to protect the regulations and protect our constitutional rights to clean air, pure water, and the preservation of natural resources. We need to pay attention to alerts from environmental groups. I know you hate to get those emails just as much as I do, but right now they're looking at 60 waste well sites in Pennsylvania to be looked at, and they're just permitting, and they're not called waste wells, but they're calling them some other euphemistic name, but they're putting the well water from the fracking wells into these spaces, and they are then going to be using these as receptacles so that they can take these waters out, because they have figured out that they can somehow work with this wastewater from fracking and get the lithium out, which is very valuable for our batteries. But that again is a messy process. In the meantime, they will have a lot of these wells being permitted. So that's something else that's kind of annoying. So again, risk is a part of all of our lives. You know that I've tripped going up the stairs just like you have. So, but these are risks that are going to be with us for a while. And with any risk, the more opportunities there are for more incidents, the more chances are something's going to happen that we're not going to like. Federal level, again, we have Representative Scanlon, Representative Toomey, Senator Casey. Again, you want to encourage them to do things like, turn back that FERC rule that would allow the liquefied natural gas to come through on trains, protect our public lands, protect our rights, again, look at our agriculture. If this stuff is impacting our crops, agriculture is Pennsylvania's #1 industry. When we start messing around with our crops and our food supplies, that's a problem. We do have jobs, and one of the things you'll hear the industry talk a lot about is all the clean energy jobs they're providing. But I think alternative energy jobs and maintaining our natural resources are places we can also find employment for people in our Commonwealth. So what do? You spread the word, tell people that this stuff is going on, comment publicly, write letters to the editor, look at the Inquirer, read their articles. There are hearings about these things. Marble's having hearings. You can go to the court in Delaware County, come and please see what's going on there. You can also provide written input. If you go to the Pennsylvania Environmental Digest, that's a great place to find everything that's going on, whatever permits are being issued all over the place, and, provide your input. They do things like, when they put in pipelines and things, they don't always do things like adequately assess where the wetlands are. That's a source of our water. So, there's all different kinds of things you can question. And with pipelines, usually if you can find some kind of endangered species, that's always good. So there are a few of them around. That's one thing that'll stop them. So I'd like to thank you for listening to this wonderfully inspiring, happy day talk about wonderful life in Delaware County. And you have to somehow keep your sense of humor because you can get a little jaded after a while. But again, risk is always relative. And there are a lot of good questions, and I'll be happy to try to help answer any of them. But I went through the ones that came in first by email, so I could start with those. So the first one, it says, well, what about pipelines? Where can I get some maps? What do I do? How do I figure it out? Well, there's a great place called the Pipeline Safety Trust. And that's something I learned about many years ago, but it's really good. And it's like the one-stop shop if you want to know anything about pipelines. The Middletown Coalition has lots of stuff about the Mariner pipeline and all the risks that are there. And they can scare you to death if you want to watch that. And then there's the Delaware River Network, which has a lot of stuff on Gibbstown. So if you're interested in that issue, so if I were looking for liquefied natural gas, I'd go the Delaware River Keeper Network. If I want stuff about the natural gas liquids, I try the Middletown Coalition. Now, someone asked, are there still regulatory obstacles? Yes, there are. And if you want to look particularly for the Gibbstown, the Mariner is still coming through, but they're still getting hung up because they have all these sinkholes and they're having problems still in parts of the Commonwealth. So, they'll still get it through, but it's going to take a lot of work. Gibbstown has some problems still to go through. They've got lots of hoops to jump through, but somehow or other they seem to know how to grease the wheels and get it done. That Empower New Jersey is good for that. And again, the Pennsylvania Environment Digest blog is a great place to go, because that is the place where David Hess, who used to be in charge of the Department of Environmental Protection, puts this out all the time, and he updates all the different permits and things that are going on all across the state and what you can do to provide input. Now, someone else, well, who's in charge of all this? Who's in charge of the DEP? Who's in charge of the PUC? Who's making all these decisions? Well, the governor appoints the secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection. The secretary tends to set the tone. And he also appoints the Public Utility Commission people. And there are 5 people there that also provide direction. Again, all of these departments usually have what do you call those, long-term employees, but the people at the top tend to pull the strings. But the bottom line is our Pennsylvania legislators and our Pennsylvania senators and representatives hold the purse strings. So they're the ones who decide where the money goes. They're the ones who decide how many inspectors do we have on those pipelines, how many people are out there monitoring how they're being built, how many people are looking at, have their boots on the ground. So both of these agencies have been cut back, and they need to have the funding. And the only way DEP was getting adequate funding in the past was by permitting. So that's kind of a bad formula if you're going to get paid by permitting natural gas operations. So makes it a little bit of a conflict of interest. And then local officials like the Marble Township, people who have turned down that, shall we call it again? I have to look at it again. The reliability station, if they've turned down that reliability station. So they have, in fact, listened to the people, because as it says, a lot of people are angry about it. They don't want it in their neighborhood. But ultimately, you and I, because we're League of Women Voters people, know that every decision we make is a political one. And so the biggest problem we have in Pennsylvania is we don't have a campaign finance limits. And because of that, we have a lot of undue influence that comes from people with deep pockets. So you hear about things like I think it's the Philadelphia Energy Solutions Group and all these other groups that have a lot of funding, which gives them greater influence than it has over the citizens of, say, Marble, who are concerned about this great compressor station that's going in their backyards. Again, there is a Citizens Advisory Council for DEP, which gives people a voice, and that meets every month. I know people on that. I've been to that. I've, said your piece, makes you feel better that you've said something. Whether it ever goes anyplace remains to be seen. Now, someone asked me about the geopolitical issues around natural gas. Well, that's always good too. So, energy makes the world go round. We think it's other things, but it's really energy. So one of the things that started all the conflict in Ukraine was fracking, believe it or not. If you go back to it, they wanted to do some fracking in Ukraine, and that was a threat to Russia because they're the ones who supply natural gas to Europe. So there was some contention over there, and there's contention among the farmers who didn't want their land to be fracked, and there were contentions being spurred by Russia, who didn't want it to be fracked either. Then because of that European pipeline to Russia, and remember that was a big deal a few years ago. Now, the other piece is the economy. And that has to do, remember, it's all money, because that where we are. There's the price of natural gas versus the price of oil. So in the United States, we have really cheap natural gas. And I'm sure you hear about how good it is for Pennsylvania because we have this cheap natural gas. Well, that's because it's based on supply and demand in this country. So if we have a lot of natural gas in Pennsylvania, the price is low because we got a good supply. But in the world, natural gas is based relative to the price of oil. So once we start exporting that natural gas, our supply will go down because the price will be higher elsewhere, and we will not be in such a good state as we are currently. Right now, 61% of the natural gas from the US previously was sent by pipelines to Mexico and Canada. Now as we have become the largest natural gas liquid producer, that means that stuff, that ethane, propane, and natural gas liquid producer, that means the liquefied natural gas. I've got to get my initials straight. Natural gas liquids are going to be to Canada, Japan, China. Okay, so we're exporting our methane now to Canada, Japan, and China on those big boats that are going to be coming from Gibbstown and other places. Our Marcus Hook stuff, that's the liquefied, the natural gas liquids will be going to Scotland and Norway. And the LNG, liquefied natural gas, goes to South Korea, Japan, Mexico, Spain, and China. And we are now the third largest liquefied natural gas producer in the world. Got it? So we are getting rich, sending our stuff abroad. And that's where the money goes. Now, we are moving up in the world, and this is where all the countries where our liquefied natural gas is going. And when it goes over there, remember, it'll go from 1/600th of its volume to its natural volume, which is billions of gallons of natural gas, so that it can be used in those countries for heat and other things. Now, someone asked, how does fracking put our water at risk? How is it, how are we getting poisoned? Well, one of the big problems is that all the waste from our natural gas industry, because of that Halliburton loophole, is determined to be non-hazardous. So they don't really have to treat it the way they have to treat things like acid drainage from coal mines, because it's not hazardous. So when you're drilling and dealing with waste, when you're transporting, you're storing and distributing it, you're going to have problems, because all the way along, first of all, you start by removing water to frack, because it takes gallons and gallons, millions of gallons of water to frack a well. Some of it they reuse over and over again, but it usually comes from our rivers and streams. And if you look at the Delaware River and you're taking water out of the Delaware River for fracking, that regulates the quality and quantity. If you look at the Delaware River, they regulate only the quantity. If you look at the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh, they do neither. They just take it. They pollute the groundwater when they frack the wells. They put these chemicals in the well. We do know what they are now. Before there was we didn't know what they were, but they're very bad chemicals. Let's put it that way. Cancer causing, things you don't want in your home, things that if you do have them in the home, they're under the sink labeled poison. And what happens is there are leaks in the casing. That's the pipeline, the pipes that, the drilling bits go through. There are, one of the other problems is there are no regulations for water wells in Pennsylvania. So sometimes when they're fracking, they run into a water well, because we don't even know where they are, and they don't have any kinds of regulations to provide for any kind of protection. And then there are injection wells where they pump the really hazardous stuff down deep into the wells. Those are the things that caused earthquakes in Ohio and places like that. And they now have injection wells in Pennsylvania, and they can result in earthquakes. And then when there's earthquakes and the earth shifts and the plates shift, then the chemicals can leak into the wells. And then they also hit abandoned wells, because in Pennsylvania we have hundreds and hundreds of abandoned wells, because we've been drilling and fracking and for drilling for oil and for decades in Pennsylvania. And if they didn't hit oil, they just left the wells and moved on. But when we're fracking for natural gas, we can run into those wells, will again provide natural channels into our waters, groundwater. And then the surface water, well, one of the things we do is because some of the water that comes up when they first frack a well is brine, which is like salt water. And because, once upon a time, most of Pennsylvania was underwater. So some of the water that comes up is going to be mixed with these salts. And they use that same brine on the roads. So if you're trying to de-ice the roads or handle dust, they just spread that nice salty water all over the roads. And guess what? Salt's not good for plants, is it? Those of us who have plants along the roads and they start brining it, you know what happens. They also, when they're doing pipeline construction, they hit these sinkholes and they try to cross waterways and wetlands, and sometimes they hit things, they don't do it quite right. And then this bentonite and other things spill into the waterways and it hits the surface. Then when they store the wastewater, sometimes they used to do it in these big pits and there's a hole in the pit and suddenly the wastewater is all over the ground. And sometimes when people who are less than honest, they used to take wastewater away in tank trucks and just, dump it wherever they wanted to instead of treating it and handling it nicely. Then they also have a lot of what they called mud that's brought up when they frack the wells, soils and stuff, and they dry that out and they cake it and they turn it into cakes. And they take that to landfills and things. And eventually, what happens to landfills after a lot of rain, that's leaching, and a lot of those chemicals and things again leach into the soil and groundwater. So bottom line is, water is a really valuable quantity, which is being compromised by our natural gas industry. Now, someone said, well, are we moving toward a greener Pennsylvania? Well, there are incentives to buy electric cars. Isn't that good, ladies? Yes, gentlemen. And they're also having they're still fighting about this regional greenhouse gas initiative of Pennsylvania to join, which is basically a cap and trade thing to deal with carbon dioxide. They have some plans for residences in terms of green buildings and retrofitting places to be more energy efficient using alternative energy sources. And they also have commercial areas that they're working to promote energy and waste reduction, having different kinds of grants for construction and so forth. And I know many of you may have been familiar with that Volkswagen grant, where because Volkswagen had sort of cheated on their emission standards, there were lots of money left over for that. And I know there were some places in Delaware County, if you looked at that, we got a grant from some industry in Delaware County so that now their cement mixers can use natural gas, which is less polluting than diesel fuel. So we're getting some benefits. Now, someone said, well, what's DELCO'S biggest problem? I think DELCO'S biggest problem is the same the rest of the world's biggest problem, and that's climate change. And it's just, it doesn't look good. And I think the other part of Delaware County's problem is probably overdevelopment. We just have too many people in too small a spot, and we just keep getting more. So those would be my two biggest problems, but I think climate change is going to bother us probably on a longer timeline than the overdevelopment. I think the overdevelopment is going to get us first. At least it's going to make us a little more uncomfortable. How's that? But I think both of them are going to change the quality of our life significantly. Now, additional resources, if you want to know about public health and fracking and all those nasty things, there is a public health, shale and public health guide that's put out by the Pittsburgh League through the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania through a grant. They also did a wonderful job up in Indiana County on a booklet all about plastics that you can also get on the same website. So if you go to Straight Scoop on Shale, you can pull them up. You can just print them out. You can just read them online. Both of them are very good documents, and they'll give you a lot of information. And I would like to thank you for listening and thank John specifically for being my consultant and editor for my PowerPoint. He did a great job. And we found out a lot. And it's not what I would call good news. How's that? But we'll make the best of it. We always women are always up for a good long fight. Took us 100 years to get the right to vote, and we just keep on fighting. So I'm going to stop sharing somehow if I can, and I'll try to answer any of the questions you have.
Roberta, that is a scary story.
Yeah,
No wonder you said Halloween.
But as I said, John, was I right in saying it's a small risk, but it's still a risk?
John, you're muted. If you can unmute.
Yes, Roberta, that's a good way to say it.
It's not as bad. I mean, the risk is certainly smaller than getting COVID, which we've all lived through for a year.
Yeah.
So it's all relative.
Roberta, would you be willing to share the links with us and we can send them out with the link to this video to our viewers?
Which links? The ones to
The ones that you
at the end?
mentioned in your presentation.
Yeah, the ones at the end.
Mhm.
Mhm. Any other questions? I'm sorry, it's such bad news. I mean, I thought fracking was bad, and I told people it was going to be coming down here through pipelines, if you were paying attention to me, correct? And then I said it was going to be the processing and the exporting, and you know, it's just the way it is.
Just to let you know too, we have several of what Roberta shared already up on our website on the environmental page, but I'll make sure that if we don't have all, I'll add the others that she spoke about. And so we can send out the link to that. And then of course we'll put this presentation up there too. Thank you.
Roberta, I have a question. I used to work right across from the big Sunoco refinery in South Philly on South 26th Street. I worked there, and they used to call those huge towers with the fire on top crackers. Is that the same thing that you're talking about at the natural gas wells?
Yeah, I think there are crackers for ethane, but there are also crackers that they can use to break down the oil as well. So like they used to crack things like, I think if you get oils, you can, like they have that bacon shale stuff that comes into the refineries, and they break it down to like gasoline and home heating oil and jet fuel. So they take different temperatures and they take off different products at different levels. So I think the cracker is basically a way they use heat to break down whatever the hydrocarbon might be. Yes, and the ethane burns off at the top, or whatever the hydrocarbon is that they think is the waste of the day.
Roberta,
Mhm.
I think you said, but is Gibbstown under construction at this point?
Yes.
Oh, God.
Well, they also have to dredge up. Well, you have to understand Gibbstown. I think I did a thing on Gibbstown last year, which was an old DuPont site full of all kinds of chemicals.
Oh.
Not very nice. They have to dig up the river and disturb all that, and
Yeah.
so it's price of progress, they say. Jane?
Just a comment about Marple. Last week, we in the Marple Township got a phone call from the township saying that there's a section of Sproul Road, which is Route 320, which is going to be closed for 8 weeks. It was not approved by the township. And the construction is being done by PICO, apparently with the approval of the state, even though the township has voted against having this station built. So it's kind of interesting to see what's going on politically.
Mm-hmm. And see, the other trick is it's the PUC. So this is going to be controlled by Pennsylvania. There's no federal people you can appeal to, because it's just like the Mariner. They said it's an interstate pipeline, not intrastate pipeline. So from here to Conshohocken, but then from Conshohocken, they'll probably go from Conshohocken to Allentown. Then from Allentown, they'll go from there to there. And if they break up the pipeline permits into small enough sections, they don't have to get the same kinds of permitting.
Mm.
And they don't have the same kind of review. It's made for play.
Mm-hmm.
You might want to mention something about what's been said about the Pennsylvania legislature. we had somebody, you know, uh, your Pennsylvania representative come and speak on,
On natural gas, I don't
well,
remember.
not only so much on natural gas, about how all the funding is taking place through the legislature.
Oh, yeah. It's called.
We
Deep-
had Vitale one
You want
time.
to see Greg Vitale has a
That's
report
what I'm
called
trying to
Deep
think.
Drilling,
Right.
Deep Pockets. So if you want to see where the money's coming from, Deep
Mhm.
Drilling, Deep Pockets will tell you the story. And that's only the beginning. It gets better every year.
And Roberta, has this natural gas problem been going on for a long time, or is this something newer?
I would say when I started on the board, and that was probably what, maybe 2008,
9.
9. Indiana County, which is in the western part of the state where the wet gas is, they were alarmed and they came to a convention and they said, this is bad. We're figuring out this is bad. And we need to do a statewide study on this because it's going to hit everybody in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So it's basically been now 12 or 15 years. And we, at that time, actually had a program with the people from Penn State who, in Philadelphia, we had them come down and talk about the Marcellus Shale, and we had people from the Delaware River Keeper Network. We had an event in actually one of those fancy hotels in the city, and talked to that. Then they came down and talked to us about it, and that was the beginning of the end, right, Olivia?
That's right. Roberta came on to the state board because she wanted to do education. And look what she's become. You know?
And we've done pipeline studies, but I think what we need to do in Delaware County is we really need to educate people about pipelines. And, you know, it's one of those things I haven't done yet, but I think we need to educate them because they're all around and people just, you know, take their backhoes and dig up the backyards and put in a mailbox, and they don't know that when digging something, they're going to cause a problem.
And by all those roads that if they're going to drain it by tanker, it's going to all come through Chester. One more thing coming through Chester. Nobody says anything about it. It's coming down the Blue Route. Well, no, it's going through Chester. To get,
Well, the Blue Routes goes right through Delaware. I think it goes through Radnor too.
yes, it does. But I mean, I think it's just that we find more and more that things just when it's in Chester, we don't have to talk about it the same way. And we really do. And
Yes, it's not good.
it's not.
I know that there's a program. Did you see tomorrow night it is? There's some kind of a march in Chester. I think I sent it out today to somebody for quality of life. It's that Chester group, Chester Environmental something or other.
Chester residents.
You know what it is. No, there's two of them. There's the one that Reverend Shade does. Is that his name, Reverend? There are two different environmental groups in Chester. One of them is a little more deliberative and one is a little more active. I always compare them to the League of Women Voters, the Carrie Catman Chat, and the Alice Paul groups. But there are two, but they're supposed to do a program, I think, tomorrow night. I just have not gotten involved in that yet. I'm not ready for that yet. I just keep my finger on the pulse and send it all to Jodine so she knows what's going on.
But Roberta, I think you can sum it up well in what you made me once say to a group of press in Harrisburg. Remember that one?
Yes, I wrote a speech for Olivia. I want to get people's attention. So it said frack is a 4-letter word.
And then she made me sit for 60 seconds and count for 60 seconds and not say a word. And by the end of 60 seconds, the entire press is going, you know, what? What did she say? It was a great speech, Roberta. You did a great job with it. But
Well, I mean, it hasn't changed. It's still
no,
a
it hasn't.
4-letter word.
I think that could become our mantra now or our slogan.
And, you know, the bottom line is it's not just affecting us, it's affecting every corner of the Commonwealth.
It is.
Every corner. There's not a stone unturned. I mean, we're just an extractive state. You know, it started with the trees. We cut down all the trees and we sent them all over the country. We then did the coal and we sent that all over the place. And then we did the oil before we did the coal. And then we're doing the frack. I mean, you know, it's just, we should have learned, but we don't. And what happens is the industries tend to take all of the profit, and we as residents bear all the cost. And I think that's what's tragic.
And you all, as I understand it, Roberta, are working, there's a coalition now with Chester County as well on pipelines. Is that how it works? Something about, or is that this other group that you were mentioning, the Middletown group?
Power, New Jersey is one where they're working coalition. We don't work very well in coalition, but there is a coalition that's working together now on these water things, these water wells
Okay.
that they're going to put in all over the state to hold the fracking water and then try to use their magic of chemistry to pull out the lithium. And then what they're going to do with all that stuff remains to be seen.
Yes.
Because one of the interesting things the legislature did is they decided they could use acid mine drainage and mix that with the fracking water. I mean, into the water so that they can frack with the acid mine draining along with the water from the streams and the creeks. And once the acid mine draining becomes part of fracking, it's no longer hazardous. Isn't that amazing? So it just, it just leaves you scratching your head.
Well, I can't thank you enough for the education. Roberta, you taught me a lot tonight. I do thank you.
Good.
I thank you for having me come, and it always is good to have somebody like John be an extra voice and an eye and an ear to keep me honest and not to be too alarmist, because it's, it is relative. The risk is relative. It's small, but it's not insignificant in my mind.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Roberta.
much.
Thank you so much, Roberta.